Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, we must warn you. The story you are about to hear is one of the most disgusting and horrible in the history of true crime. A tale so foul and loathsome that it is often shunned and little known, despite the fact that 16 innocent people would lose their lives. It is a story of savage manipulation and abuse, incest, family annihilation, and spree killing, including the most horrifying acts of domestic violence ever recorded in American history. Please be prepared and forewarned as we tell you the story of the horrible Ronald Gene Simmons and the Mockingbird Hill Massacre.
Let's begin. Prologue, December 28th, 1987. The killer drove south on Highway 7 through the southern edge of the Ozark Mountains, north of the Arkansas River, through strands of black cherry and sweet gum, eating crackers and sipping wine as he wound through deserted Arkansas Tech University and into the town of Russellville, pulling to a stop at the Peel and Eddy law firm. He put a battered straw cowboy hat on in a sad attempt to hide his identity, then entered the office.
Kathy Kendrick was sitting behind her desk, focused on paperwork, when the killer approached her. When she looked up and saw who it was, a man she'd once worked with who'd been creepily obsessed with her, she said, "Oh no," and started to rise as the killer pulled a snub-nosed .22 revolver from his pocket and shot her in the head.
As Kathy fell back in her chair, the killer fired 3 more shots into her skull before turning and dashing back to his car.
The killer then drove down side streets, avoiding Main Street, to Taylor Oil Company, entered, and shot his former boss, Rusty Taylor, twice in the chest through his open office door.
Taylor would pull through and live. But as he was leaving, a door by the dock opened and a man named Jim Chafin, a local firefighter who worked part-time at the oil company, started through, and the killer coldly shot him right in the eye, killing him instantly.
The killer then sped back through town to the Sinclair mini market, replacing the cowboy hat with a baseball hat, passing police cars speeding in the opposite direction with their sirens wailing.
The killer entered the Sinclair mini market, where another ex-boss, David Salyer, sat at a table with his friend Tony Serta, drinking coffee, and began to fire at them, missing as they ducked beneath the table.
The woman behind the counter, Roberta Woolery, screamed, "Gene? Gene, what are you doing?" and grabbed the telephone. The killer fired 2 quick shots at her, striking her once in the mouth and once in the shoulder.
David Salyer then grabbed a chair and charged the killer, screaming, "Get out, you son of a bitch!"
The killer fired at him, the bullet striking the chair and ricocheting off and hitting him in the head. Tony Serta then grabbed a 6-pack of soda and began hurling cans at the killer, howling, "You son of a bitch!"
The killer then fled the store.
Though wounded, Roberta continued calling 911, saying,
"This is Salyer Mini Mart on 64 East. A man just came in here and started shooting, and he's got me in the chin and another guy is down."
"Which way did he head when he left?"
"Headed east. Please, hurry. Blood is everywhere." I'm about to pass out.
I've got an ambulance on the way.
I'm pretty sure I know who it is.
Who do you think it is?
Gene Simmons. He used to be an employee here. He quit 2 weeks ago.
The killer then drove to Woodline Motor Freight, strolled in, and shot his former supervisor, Joyce Butts, in the head and chest.
He then walked into the computer room where Vicki Jackson cowered on the floor, looking down at her and saying,
Vicki, get up. I'm not gonna hurt you.
Gene, please, don't shoot me.
Oh, I'm not gonna hurt you, but you haven't come to Sinclair to see me.
Gene, I went down there, but you weren't there.
You know I just work on weekends. I just want you to call the police. I want to turn myself into you because you've never done anything to hurt me.
The killer tried to hand her a gun he had in a bag. She told him to just lay it on the desk.
As Vicki called the police, the killer asked, Would you like a cigarette? I'll go get them for you.
They're in the other room.
As Vicki talked to dispatch, the killer brought her cigarettes and said, Oh, everything is all over with. I just wanted to kill Joyce. I didn't want to hurt anyone else.
Within minutes, the building was surrounded by police and sheriff's deputies. Fearing a hostage situation, the chief of police, Herb Johnston, came into the office unarmed to negotiate, saying simply, quote, just give me the damn gun, end quote, which the killer did.
The killer, Ronald Gene Simmons, put up no fight and was arrested.
He was the father of 7, with several grandchildren, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who'd served over 20 years in the military, receiving a Bronze Star Medal, the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross, and the Air Force Small Arms Expert Marksmanship Ribbon before retiring with the rank of Master Sergeant.
Extremely disturbingly, law enforcement discovered he'd previously had a warrant for his arrest from New Mexico for incest, having impregnated his own daughter.
Fearing for his large family, a sheriff's investigator drove to his home, a 13-acre homestead in nearby Dover.
The homestead, which he'd named Mockingbird Hill, was like something out of a Rob Zombie horror movie. Driving
up the steep red clay driveway, there was a crude concrete privacy fence topped with barbed wire, hand-painted no trespassing signs dotting the drive, abandoned vehicles and piles of junk, a sign with childish lettering reading Princess Lane. At the top of the driveway was a ramshackle building consisting of a double-wide trailer welded onto a clapboard home, several cars parked in front.
The single entrance to the ramshackle structure was a sliding glass door which was locked from the inside. The investigator knocked. There was no reply. He peered inside windows, one of which was wide open, but could make out nothing but the blinking of Christmas tree lights and the blue glow of a distant television. So he radioed in that there was no signs of anyone at the home and that he had a bad, bad feeling.
Back at the precinct house, Ronald Gene Simmons refused to talk. Since the judge who signed search warrants was out of town, the sheriff decided to conduct an emergency search and went to the property himself. Sheriff James Boleyn.
Crawling in through an open window, the sheriff nearly fell atop the body of a young woman lying next to a Christmas tree. The killer's daughter, Sheila. A few feet away lay her husband, Dennis McNulty, and the killer's 7-year-old granddaughter, Sylvia Gale, whom the killer had fathered with his own daughter.
Also lying in the living room, covered with coats, were the killer's son, Billy, and his wife, Renata.
Wrapped in plastic in abandoned cars were two of the killer's grandchildren, Trey and Michael, both only a year old.
In a deep latrine pit behind the house, covered with tarps, trash, and barbed wire, were the bodies of the killer's wife, Becky, his eldest son, Gene Jr., his 3-year-old granddaughter, Barbara, as well as his 17-year-old daughter, Loretta, his 14-year-old son, Eddie, his 11-year-old daughter, Marianne, and his 8-year-old daughter, Becky.
During the week of the 1987 Christmas holidays, Ronald Gene Simmons had murdered 16 people, 14 of whom were his own family, one of which was a child he'd fathered with his own daughter. And the world wondered, who was this monster, Ronald Gene Simmons?
Chapter 1. Little Gene.
Ronald Gene Simmons was born on July 15th, 1940, in Chicago, Illinois, to Loretta and William Simmons.
He was tiny, 6 weeks premature. He was the couple's second child, having an older brother named Robert, 5 years older than him.
And during that 5-year span between children, Loretta had divorced her husband, gone to college, graduated summa cum laude, and then remarried William.
Obviously, Loretta was quite the character. She'd been orphaned at age 10 and raised by her aunt, and showed great academic promise as a child and young adult, until her higher learning aspirations had been thwarted by the Great Depression, having to quit college when her family could no longer pay the tuition.
In 1942, Loretta had another child, a daughter named Nancy, and then William suddenly died of a heart attack.
A year later, in 1943, when Gene was 3, Loretta was remarried to a man named William Griffin, whom Gene would call Dad Griffin. In May 1945, they had a son named Peter.
Gene's stepfather, Dad Griffin, worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, and in 1946 he was transferred to Little Rock, Arkansas. So the family packed up and moved to Arkansas. But instead of living in Little Rock, they moved to a secluded rural farmhouse deep in the Ozarks.
They had to pump water by hand and used an outhouse and were surrounded by forest. This would be an idyllic time period for little Gene, a type of back-to-the-land living he'd later pine for as an adult. His homestead of Mockingbird Hill was only 10 miles from his childhood home.
But when Gene was 10, the family moved again to a suburb right outside of Little Rock called Landmark. And this is when Gene became quite the problem child.
Gene's older brother Robert joined the Navy at 17, and afterwards Gene was the eldest of the children and began to torment his younger sister Nancy and half-brother Peter.
Gene was a strange, troubled youth, a loner with no friends, who delighted in being cruel. His grades in school were abysmal, his teachers all complaining that he was blatantly disobedient, refusing to follow orders.
Not knowing what to do with his surly stepson, Dad Griffin resorted to spankings, even whipping him with a garden hose. But this only made Gene more rebellious, as he mocked his stepfather and taunted him, telling him, "You hit me again, I'll knock your head off." So they sent him to a Catholic boarding school for troubled boys called the Morris Academy. But they soon relented and allowed him to return home.
For a short time, Gene's behavior improved, but soon he was back to his cruel ways, and they again sent him back to the Morris Academy.
Meanwhile, the health of both Loretta and Dad Griffin was taking a bad turn. Loretta had cervical cancer, as well as arthritis and hardening of the arteries, and Dad Griffin was having bouts of debilitating allergies made worse by the pollen-rich air of Arkansas. So while Gene was still in boarding school, the rest of the family moved to New Mexico, where the dry air and warmth was said to be better for their health.
But because of all the medical bills, the family couldn't afford to keep sending Gene to the Morris Academy, and in 1956 joined his family in New Mexico, surly and rebellious as ever, a serious delinquent and problem child at Albuquerque's Highland High School.
In 1957, Dad Griffin was transferred to Berkeley, and the whole family traveled across the country to California, and Gene started at Berkeley High. But then they moved again across the bay to Mill Valley, and Gene enrolled in Tamalpais High, finishing his senior year of high school there, but not receiving enough credits to graduate.
Instead of returning to high school and trying to get his diploma, Gene got a job at a fancy golf club as a busboy.
This ended when Gene returned home one day covered in garbage, coffee grinds, grease, and rotten lettuce. When his family asked what had happened, he refused to tell them, and was so humiliated he wouldn't even return to the restaurant to receive his final paycheck, instead enlisting in the Navy just as his older brother had done.
Chapter 2: The Navy.
The structure and discipline of military life surprisingly suited Gene quite well, and he excelled in the Navy.
After boot camp, he took high school equivalency classes and got his GED. He took military courses in typing and personal administration. Stationed in Guam, he worked for the Navy as a clerk and distinguished himself as an excellent typist, a hard worker, and a problem solver.
He was stationed in Guam for nearly 2 years and only left the island once. Dedicated to his work, he made no friends, a strange loner pencil pusher.
In 1959, now a yeoman third class making $113 a month, he was stationed with the Pacific Reserve at Bremerton, Washington, and it was here he met the love of his life, Rebecca Ulibarri, who went by Becky.
Becky was a typist and quite good. However, when someone was praising her skills, Gene snorted and said, "I can type faster than that." So a contest was arranged, and Gene won, telling her that since she lost, she had to have some punch with him. Oh my God, sorry, small aside, but if that's how a dude tried to pick me up, I would throat punch him. Let me humiliate you at the thing that you're making your living at, and then use my winnings to coerce you into dating me. What romance.
That's kind of like what their relationship would be like forever, too.
Ugh.
At that time, Gene was a really good-looking guy. Thick black hair, skinny, with piercing eyes and a sly smile. And he swept Becky off her feet, told her she was beautiful, and when she said she loved children, he told her his dream was to have a large family and live on a farm in Arkansas.
Like Gene, Becky grew up with a stepfather, her own father having abandoned the family. She was part Native American and had luxuriant, long, straight black hair and a round, pretty face.
Becky had to leave Washington and go to Minnesota to help her sister with a new baby. But she and Gene wrote each other constantly. and he eventually asked her to marry him, and she accepted. The two were married in July of 1960.
In 1961, their first son was born on Gene's birthday of July 15th, and they named him Ronald Gene Simmons, Jr.
Gene eventually left the Navy, and the family moved to San Francisco, where Gene worked at Bank of America, verifying deposits from armored cars, making $9,000 a year, which was 6 times more than he made in the Navy. And he thought about becoming a banker, enrolled in college, but he did abysmal, getting a D in business English.
Without the tight structure of the military, Gene felt lost. It felt like the only place he belonged. So in 1963, he enrolled in the Air Force, even though he'd have to re-enter the military at a reduced rank.
He was stationed at Langley Air Force Base in Norfolk, Virginia. And in October, Gene and Becky had their second child, Sheila Marie, who quickly became Gene's absolute favorite.
It is here that Gene begins to display his bizarre qualities. He wouldn't allow Becky to wear makeup or even have her hair down, insisting she pull it back. He refused to have a telephone or allow mail to be delivered to the house. Instead, mail was sent to a post office box only he had control over.
Becky had never learned to drive, and he forbid her from ever learning, making her completely reliant on him.
He was the sole breadwinner and gave Becky a strict budget to work with. If she went over budget, he would berate her, often in public, and she was often forced to beg for money for clothes.
He also began to constantly correct her grammar, humiliating her in front of other couples.
In May of 1964, Gene was promoted to Airman First Class, and in January of 1965, the couple had their third child, William Henry Simmons, whom they called Billy. A year later, Gene was promoted to Staff Sergeant.
Despite the numerous pay raises as he climbed rank, Gene refused to increase Becky's tight allowance and even moved the family to an Air Force trailer park to save $50 a year in rent.
But they were a happy family. In 1966, Gene spent some of his hard-earned savings on a Dodge van, which they drove across the country, visiting Loretta and Dad Griffin in California, and swinging through Colorado to visit Becky's family.
As the 60s progressed, so too did the war in Vietnam. And in August of 1966, Gene's service ended, and he offered to re-enlist and serve in Vietnam, but only if he was guaranteed a spot in the OCI, the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, which he received.
He got a bonus of $1,200, took a course certifying him as an administrative supervisor for the OCI. Before he left, he bought a trailer for his family, towing it out to Colorado, parking it in a pasture on Becky's stepfather's land, parking his van beside it, and taking off the tires, putting it up on blocks to ensure no one would drive it while he was gone, and in August of 1967, was flown to Saigon.
Chapter 3, Vietnam.
Gene worked at the OSI headquarters building at 161B Chai Lang Street in Saigon, where he coordinated investigations and background screenings for clearances.
Though he was just a glorified pencil pusher, more accountant than spy, Gene was filled with a sense of self-importance and threw himself into his job, working double shifts and memorizing complicated operation procedures.
Gene was supplied with a maid, a cook, a laundry service which picked up and delivered. He was given his own Jeep to drive and commissary privileges. Meanwhile, back in Colorado, Becky and the children were forced to live on the meager $40 a month Gene sent her, having to rely on her mother to drive her to town to shop, which was humiliating. Even from 8,000 miles away, he was able to dominate and control her.
In Saigon, Gene's diligence and dedication was really working out. Studying receipts and papers and files, he was able to notice discrepancies, eventually leading to investigations that uncovered a number of black market trade operations and illicit money exchanges, and he was awarded the Bronze Star for his efforts.
On July 26, 1968, Gene completed his service in Vietnam and returned stateside, where he was stationed to the OSI detachment in San Francisco. He went and retrieved his van and had the trailer towed to a mobile home park in nearby Vacaville.
In San Francisco, Gene worked at discovering who in the Air Force had gone hippie. San Francisco was full of anti-war protesters and counterculture freaks, and Gene searched through petitions, monitored memberships in groups like Veterans for Peace, searching out the traitors. He also helped with narcotics violations, finding out who was smoking the dreaded evil weed.
In March of 1969, he was promoted to technical sergeant.
Sadly, on April 1st, 1970, Gene's mother, Loretta, died. Gene, doing his paperwork shuffle, was somehow able to scam his brother and sister out of the insurance policy and received all the money. In July, Gene and Becky had their second daughter, and Gene named her after his mother, Loretta May.
Gene Jr. and Sheila were in school now and not doing very well. They were both incredibly shy, to the point of non-communication, and had difficulty learning to read. They were introverted from being so sequestered.
Gene took an extended vacation and went off by himself to Arkansas, where he attempted to buy the little homestead in the Ozarks he lived on as a child, but was unsuccessful. He'd forever harbor the dream of living on a homestead with a large family.
He changed a lot physically, was no longer the thin, suave-looking man with the thick hair. He was now 34, but looked much older. His hair had thinned, begun to recede, and he'd put on a lot of weight and had a considerable belly.
He received the Air Force Commendation Medal for Meritorious Service. Then, in May of 1973, he was transferred to England, bringing the whole family across the ocean with him.
Gene was put in charge of all rationed goods, including gasoline and liquor, and was a meticulous record keeper.
On July 15th, 1973, Gene and Becky had another son, Edward Davenport Simmons, whom they called Eddie.
Things were beginning to grow very dark and weird for the family, whom he'd kept as sequestered and isolated in England as he had back in the States. Becky tried to assert some independence, pleading with Gene to teach her how to drive and let her get her license. And Gene replied by backhanding her.
Gene had always been gruff to Becky, but now he'd begun being physically violent.
While Gene Jr. had seemingly come out of his shell and was now doing very well in school, becoming heavily involved in chess, Sheila was still getting abysmal grades. But she was still Gene's favorite.
Gene displayed a sense of affection for Sheila he didn't with his other children. He'd often have her cuddle up on his lap and kiss him on the lips.
Gene had taken photos of all the children bathing, seemingly innocent pictures, but disturbingly, he kept the photos of Sheila naked in the bathtub separate.
In December, Gene received a belated medal for his service in Vietnam, the Gallantry Cross, and in April 1976 was sent back to the United States to work in Cloudcroft, New Mexico at the Cloudcroft Electro-Optical Research Facility, monitoring satellites and space lasers.
Chapter 4, New Mexico.
Gene had always longed to rekindle that feeling of a large family living off the land that he'd had as a child in Arkansas, that brief moment of happiness he'd had living in the country. And after arriving in New Mexico, he sought a place with land and found it in Wills Canyon.
Wills Canyon was about 11 miles southeast of Cloudcroft, and there Gene found 3 acres, a clapboard house with 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and a spring for water. The land was on a steep hill, a bulldozer having cut a swath of flatness into the canyon slope, then piled the excavated rocks in an ugly ring around the house. The price was $24,000, and Gene put down 10 in cash and signed a 5-year mortgage.
And so Gene and the Simmons family set to homesteading, which I can tell you from experience can be tough going, especially when you're trying to work your way up from little infrastructure. Gene gathered pamphlets from the agriculture department on farming, as well as hundreds of books and magazines on gardening, animal husbandry, irrigation, and water storage, hoarding issues of Mother Earth News.
Gene took to wearing bib overalls and a cowboy hat, making plans for chicken coops, rabbit pens, and terraced gardens.
Little Gene had just turned 15, and he started a chess club at school. He'd be a big chess nerd for the rest of his life. But Big Gene had other plans for him, for all the children. He wanted to use their labor to turn the land into a working homestead.
The children were organized into work crews that cleared and stacked rocks, mixing mortar and carrying concrete blocks for a retaining wall at the rear of the house, cutting brush, grubbing out stumps, and terracing the hillside. Even little Eddie, hardly more than a toddler, was assigned to pick up scraps.
The only one of the children who wasn't forced into hours of daily manual labor was Sheila, whom Gene called his little princess.
This caused a rift in the family, especially with little Loretta, who, unlike the other shy and introverted kids, was very outgoing and extroverted, and wasn't afraid to speak her mind.
Loretta was always demanding to know why Sheila got extra presents, why Sheila didn't have to work, why Sheila got to go to town with Dad while the rest of the kids labored. Gene would simply say, "I love all my children, but Ladybug loves me more than the others do."
And Gene was harder and harder on little Gene, calling him an ingrate, a sissy, saying he was afraid to work, despite having built a chicken shack and storage shed and retaining wall.
One night, Becky timidly suggested that he not work the children so hard, saying,
"Gene, they're just babies. Can't they have some time to be kids?"
"Well, they're gonna be grown up someday, and it's time they started learning what it is all about. I can't do everything around here."
"I know, Gene, but..."
"But what? Are you turning against me too? Turning them all against me? Don't I do everything for all of you? Where would you be without me, married to some drunken coal miner? This is my home, and I will have respect." And then he backhanded her across the face.
Becky tried to turn from him, but he grabbed her, saying,
"Don't you ever turn from me, by God. You will show me some respect." And he slugged her in the face, knocking her across the kitchen floor.
Little Gene then leapt at his father, screaming, "Stop it, you bastard!"
Little Gene tried to fight his father, but it was no match. Big Gene beat him to the ground, smashing him in the face until the other children all gathered, howling and crying, begging for him to please stop.
The next day, little Gene left, hitchhiking to Becky's parents in Colorado. But Gene was able to convince his namesake son to return, driving to Colorado himself to get him. But things would never be the same between the two of them again.
Then Gene received troubling news. The Air Force announced that the Cloudcroft Electro-Optical Research Facility would soon be placed on caretaker status and would probably close. If so, Gene will be transferred somewhere else and would have to give up on his little homestead. So Gene set to protect his position, working hard, cutting costs, and improving efficiency, hoping to keep the facility open.
While he desperately wanted the facility to stay open and keep his job, He was also becoming eligible for retirement, so he decided if the facility stayed open, he'd sign up for another 4-year stint in the Air Force. If it closed, he would retire.
Gene scrimped and saved. He'd often be sent away for work, and the Air Force always supplied first-class tickets. So he'd cash them in and buy economy tickets, keeping the difference. He even got his children in on his money-making schemes, forming the Simmons & Sons Janitorial Service to clean and maintain the Laser Communications ground station, getting little Gene and Billy to clean the facility, and of course, keeping all the pay.
Years slowly ticked by. Christmas always the biggest holiday. They'd drag out all the old Christmas cards and hang them by string around the house, cut and decorate a tree. Birthdays were big as well, Gene always making a big deal over having a cake. Birthday cakes were these magical things to Gene that could erase all drama and bring the family back a sense of peace.
Then another child was born, Rebecca Lynn, bringing the family brood to 7 children. It had been a hard pregnancy. Doctors worried about Becky's age, and they told her another pregnancy could kill her, and that she should get a tubal ligation, which made Gene irate.
But Becky had the procedure done, which disgusted Gene. He began to see her as less than a woman now, unworthy of his love.
In 1978, Ronald Gene Simmons received a performance report from the Air Force that read,
Master Sergeant Simmons has demonstrated outstanding performance in administrative and financial duties. Sergeant Simmons is a loyal, mature, and conscientious NCO. It is recommended that he be promoted to Senior Master Sergeant well ahead of his contemporaries.
Chapter 5, The Coin Show.
Firefly, how short is life? I dreamt we had more than 20. I have seen this before, and I have lived more than plenty. Now lay me in the ocean. Why lullabies? I've used my time. Now lend me to the ocean. Sing my songs when I'm gone. I know sorrow, I know pain. Let them have me if I'm ready.
Gene and Sheila continued their weird relationship, the family growing used to it. While Gene barked orders at the other children, slapping Becky around, and was especially hard on little Gene, he called Sheila Ladybug and his special girl and his little princess, which was her favorite. He constantly bought her little presents, let her ride up front in the car while Becky was forced to ride in the back.
As Sheila grew older, she came to resemble her mother more and more, to the point where the two were practically doppelgangers. It was simply uncanny how much the little girl looked like her mother, like a little clone.
In July of 1980, Sheila was 16, nearing her 17th birthday, and Gene decided to take her on a vacation to California, renting a Pontiac to drive across country, stopping in Arizona for a coin collecting festival, and then to California to visit Dad Griffin.
It was really little Gene who collected coins, though Sheila did it at her father's urging, but she had no interest in mints, dates, and errors and all that. And for Gene, it was all a deeply disturbing ruse to get her alone with him for an extended period of time.
As they drove across the country, Sheila, with the map on her lap, following their course with her finger, Gene pulled his daughter close to him, whispering,
"Little princess, I love you. I really love you. You know, you are really the woman of the family now. just like I'm the man. Do you know what that means?
Yes.
I mean, there are things a man needs, things that Mom and I just don't share anymore.
Like what?
Well, she doesn't really understand me anymore, sweetheart. Not like you do. There's a lot Mom used to do that you have to do for me now. You're so important. You're the only one I can count on. The only one who can make me happy. Do you think I ought to be happy, Ladybug?
You do everything for us.
That's right, and I always will. You are my sunshine, my little princess. As long as I know you love me, everything is going to work out just fine. And you do love me, don't you?
Yes, I love my daddy.
Horrifyingly, Ronald Gene Simmons had been planning an incestuous relationship with his daughter for years, collecting newspaper and magazine articles on the subject, stories about the dynastic intermarriages of Egypt and the Habsburg Empire.
They got a motel room outside of Phoenix, Arizona with 2 twin beds. Gene telling his daughter to sleep in his bed with him, because if they used both beds, they'd be charged more.
Innocent, naive Sheila crawled into bed with her father, who told her, "Don't be afraid, I won't hurt you," before raping her.
Chapter 6. Retirement.
Then Gene got word that the Air Force would officially be closing the Cloudcroft Electro-Optical Research Facility.
Gene was offered a promotion, the hitch being he would be transferred halfway across the world to Turkey. So instead of leaving New Mexico and his homestead, he announced his retirement from the Air Force.
His retirement pay was half of what he'd been earning, and the large family had barely been able to survive on that. But Gene got it in his mind that he could be completely self-sufficient on his rocky little 3 acres, even though he had no real experience farming or ranching whatsoever.
Trying to fit the image of a farmer, Gene now grew a beard, which he'd have the children measure, encouraging them to draw pictures of it.
That Christmas was bleak. There was no money for presents. There was a crying baby, a new mouth to feed, and the family lived on cornflakes, beans, Velveeta cheese, and tortillas.
Becky's tubal ligation had brought on early menopause and sent her into a deep depression. She started calling Gene Dad, partly in solidarity with the children, partly because she'd almost become one of the children herself. It was all weird. It was all bad.
Little Gene graduated high school and started attending New Mexico State University and moved out. He became coach of the high school chess team that he had started and won the Co-Junior Chess Championship of New Mexico, winning a $500 Kiwanee Club scholarship.
But back at the homestead, Big Gene claimed his namesake son had moved out because he was lazy and wouldn't work.
And Gene carried on his disgusting, bizarre, and incestuous relationship with his daughter, Sheila. Though the family had no money for food, he managed to buy her cowboy boots, gingham shirts, and colorful blouses, following her around with a Polaroid camera and constantly snapping pictures of her.
He'd tell her,
"Ladybug, I love you so very, very much. You are the world to me, little princess. What we have done together is not wrong, no matter what anyone tells you. I did it to protect you, so no one can take advantage of you. It is our secret, though. Do you understand?"
"Yes, Daddy."
Every afternoon, he would drive to the school and pick Sheila up, leaving the other children sitting on the curb to wait for the bus. Then they'd have sex in the back of the van, despite Sheila telling her father it didn't feel right and was painful.
Then, after another horribly cash-strapped Christmas in March, Sheila realized she was pregnant.
Chapter 7. The Prom.
On March 21st, 1981, Ronald Gene Simmons took his 17-year-old daughter to her senior prom. He bought her a new dress of pale robin's egg blue with white lace trim and had photographs taken of her before they left.
Sheila didn't want to go, had no date, but Gene insisted, driving her there to the prom and dropping her off.
Gene then returned home and told his wife that their daughter was pregnant, saying,
"This is our baby, and we have to do everything we can for Sheila. She needs us. No one else needs to know anything about it."
Becky went into a depression akin to catatonic shock, spending days in bed weeping. Meanwhile, Gene became the expectant father and grandfather, buying books on baby names, bringing his daughter pamphlets on nutrition and breastfeeding, and enrolling Sheila in his civilian health and medical program and taking her to be examined.
Becky eventually reported this disturbing news to little Gene, who was understandably beyond horrified and utterly disgusted. Becky begged her son not to tell anyone, saying how Big Gene could be arrested, CPS could take away the children, that the family would be destroyed.
Little Gene capitulated for a while, but eventually the burden of knowing of this horror became too much, and he contacted social services and told them what was going on.
On April 20th, 1981, a social worker was sent to Cloudcraft High School to investigate. By now, rumors had gotten out and were circling around.
The caseworker met with Sheila at the school, and Sheila confirmed it all. Yes, she was pregnant with her father's child.
Caseworker then went to the family homestead and confronted Gene, who also confirmed it all, saying, "I'm sure you understand that I had to do it so she could learn about those things, to protect her. Sheila is very naive and trusting, and it was my duty as a father. We've discussed this, and we've decided that the child should be raised as part of this family, and when it's old enough, we will tell it about its heritage. We know what we are doing, and we really don't need your help."
Social worker contacted county prosecutors, who, using the threat of arrest, forced Gene and the rest of the family to begin psychological counseling.
But then Gene learned that anything he said to a counselor could be used in court against him, and stopped all contact with social services.
On June 17, 1981, Sheila gave birth to a baby girl named Sylvia Gale.
Social services asked the district attorney for a consent decree to remove the children from the home and put Gene on pre-prosecution probation.
At the request of the district attorney, a deputy sheriff went to interview Sheila and Becky. They refused to talk or make a statement of any kind.
Now, in a panic, Gene went to the bank and remortgaged his land, receiving a $14,000 loan. He quickly rented a moving van, and the family packed up all their meager possessions and headed north out of the state, little Gene staying behind to attend college and to see to the sale of the property.
When a sheriff finally arrived with a warrant for Gene's arrest for incest, Gene and his family were long gone.
Chapter 8. Escape to Arkansas.
Gene had always longed to return to the Ozarks. The happiest days of his life had been the few years of childhood he'd lived on that dilapidated homestead in the forest, pumping water and using an outhouse. So he headed to Arkansas.
He rented a little house in the tiny town of Ward, where there was no bars, no movie theaters, and no shopping malls.
The warrant for Gene's arrest was never given to the FBI, where it would have been available to state and local police. And so the Simmons family settled into the tiny town unencumbered. The children all registered for school, and Gene got a job as a file clerk at the Veterans Administration Medical Center, while also researching how to attain a fake Social Security number and create a new identity.
They held a big party for Sheila's 18th birthday, Gene himself decorating the cake, writing, "Happy birthday, sweetheart Sheila Marie."
Gene got a raise, and that Christmas showered everyone with gifts, giving Becky a waffle maker, toy trucks and dolls for the younger kids, an electronic game for Billy, and a portable radio for Sheila.
And Gene continued having a sexual relationship with his daughter, telling her, "There is so much you don't understand, sweetheart. Things can never be right between Mom and me unless they are right between you and me." And then, after months and months of wrangling, Gene was finally able to sell his property in New Mexico, getting $35,000 for the hillside homestead on the 3 acres. Things were going just wonderful.
I don't have to look no further, 'cause I've reached my destination. I used to be lost, but now I'm found. As long as I know that you'll be around, I don't have to keep on searching. I'm right where I wanna be. I used to be so sad, now I'm glad I found something I never had, and I'm ready. Yeah, yeah. This time I'm going all in. Yes, I'm ready. Yeah, yeah. I'm ready for the...
That summer, Gene bought a little wading pool and splashed about with his children, taking the family to the zoo and the state fair, where he had photographs of himself and Sheila turned into a calendar.
Sheila gave up on high school. Her grades were always terrible. And so Gene enrolled her in the Droffin School, where she could learn secretarial work. And the school was located right next to his work, giving him the opportunity to drive her to school and pick her up every day.
Though Gene did this as an obvious means of having more time to spend with her, going to school gave Sheila a sense of independence. She'd been cloistered for years, kept locked up. Now she was discovering herself in the outside world.
And then she found out she was pregnant again. Though Gene, who considered himself a conservative and railed against the sin of abortion, having another incestuous child and the threat it brought to him was just too much. and so he took Sheila to get an abortion.
After the abortion, Sheila really changed. She gained an emotional maturity. She wasn't a child anymore. She refused to ever have sex with her father again, and she began to see a boy studying business at the Droughton School, Dennis McNulty.
Feeling that he was losing his daughter and lover, Gene sought to further isolate the family and bought 13 acres outside of the town of Dover.
Just like that, Gene quit his job, packed all the family's belongings up, and moved to his new piece of land, again hoping to subsist off of homesteading and his small retirement monthly income.
And he named this land Mockingbird Hill.
Chapter 9. Mockingbird Hill.
The land was located right on a paved county road, where a rutted red clay driveway rose steeply up to a mobile home rudely welded onto a shotgun shack, surrounded by small pines and scrub oak. The only heat was from a small wood stove, and the single bathroom was broken.
Gene immediately had the kids dig an outhouse hole, what he called a waste disposal system, setting a crude seat over it and surrounding it with rusted tin roofing wired to metal fence posts and the headboard from an old bed.
Ugh, sad. A nice outhouse is a priority on a homestead, and one of the easiest outbuildings to construct. A good outhouse can really set the tone for a good homestead.
Gene threw himself into labor, roaming lumber yards looking for chipped or crumbling concrete blocks that could be bought for a discount, having the children work tirelessly filling the gullies and potholes in the driveway, using toy wagons and buckets to haul dirt.
Billy, who'd grown into a bit of a carpenter, worked building a shed. Gene bought chickens and a large propane tank and covered the property in no trespassing signs to, quote, keep out the dope fiends and perverts.
Gene named the circular driveway after Sheila, painting a sign that read Little Princess Lane.
But as Gene and his brood worked, Sheila began to inch away more and more. She was still corresponding with Dennis McNulty, who even started visiting her at the house. Gene was gruff and surly to the suitor, but did ask Dennis if he could use him as a reference on a job application, Dennis agreeing.
Gene eventually got a job as an industrial cleaner at the Atkins Pickle Company, a 75-mile round trip. But that winter, the pickle plant had to downsize, and Gene was laid off. He then got a job at the Del Monte plant, processing frozen food.
Sheila was branching further and further out, getting a job at Hardee's with Billy, seeing Dennis often, obviously smitten and in love. Gene would badger her, tell her Dennis would never accept their daughter, Sylvia Gale, and he would make her life miserable.
Gene had his own little room in the ramshackle house and took to spending more and more time there, drinking, sleeping in there. Becky now sleeping in the room with the youngest kids. As he slipped into alcoholism and became meaner, everyone avoided Gene the best they could.
Billy graduated high school, bought himself a truck, was working full-time at Hardee's, and started making plans to move out. Loretta was in high school now and doing very well. She was quite popular, had great grades, and had started attending church. She asked her father if she could go out on a date. He replied, "Hell no. You see what happened to your sister, don't you? That's what comes of dating." Absolute bullshit. That's not what happened.
Back in New Mexico, little Gene had gotten married and was expecting his first child.
Then Dennis asked Sheila to marry him, and she accepted.
Gene refused to give his blessing to the marriage, refused to buy her a dress or a wedding gift.
But he did begrudgingly go to the wedding, but he sat in seething silence throughout it.
After Sheila married and moved out, Gene stopped taking family pictures, stopped everything. He quit his job at Del Monte, spending all of his time in his dark room, drinking and fantasizing about his daughter.
But eventually, in desperate financial straits, Gene started working part-time at the Russellville Mini Mart.
And eventually, in January of 1985, Gene found a clerical job at Woodline Motor Freight.
And this was a good job that valued his years working as a clerk for the Air Force. But he was the only man among a half-dozen female workers, which he was at the bottom rung of, and that filled him with resentment and anger.
Seeing women as only sexual objects or maids, he began to inappropriately flirt, in particular with a woman named Kathy Kendrick, going so far as to bring her flowers and stalk her.
Less than a year later, he'd burst into a law firm where she was then working and shoot her in the head.
Then Billy moved out and was getting married, and both Billy's wife Renata and Sheila were having babies.
Being a grandfather should have been a special time, but it just spurned Gene's rage and paranoia. He saw all his children as ingrates that were moving on and leaving him. First little Gene, then Sheila, now Billy, all good-for-nothing ingrates who spurned his love and abandoned the homestead.
That Christmas was especially sad, as half his brood was gone. He just lay on the sofa watching television and getting drunk.
As the spring of 1986 came on, he seemingly gave up his tyranny, letting Loretta wear makeup and go out on dates.
And Becky had grown independent as well, now openly defying her tyrant husband. She even began to think about leaving him, plotting her escape with little Gene.
Becky and Gene had been married 20 years now, and Becky knew that if she divorced him, she could receive half his monthly retirement check, giving her some financial independence.
She just wanted to finish raising the little ones. Loretta was now 17, almost an adult. Eddie was 14, Marianne was 11, and Rebecca Lynn was 8.
Gene was now an utterly broken man. He became mean and surly at work, often hungover, eyes red, screaming at Kathy for rebuffing his advances. And then, suddenly, he just quit in a huff, storming out.
The younger children now communicated with Gene solely by slipping notes under his door, begging for lunch money or to be allowed to go play with a friend. Loretta began to call him a fat drunk and muttering that she hated him.
Gene wrote Sheila a letter saying, "I want to start by saying, honey, I love you. I love you and I will go to my grave loving you. You have destroyed me. You have caused me a great deal of pain, suffering, sorrow, and loneliness. I miss you very much. I will see you in hell."
Gene stopped bathing, shaved only sporadically. Not only overweight, he had the puffiness of an alcoholic now. His thin hair hung lackluster and knotted beneath a dirty baseball hat. Just a broken shell of a human.
Gene then went to the Walmart in Russellville and bought a snub-nosed Harrington and Richardson .22 revolver.
Then he told Becky, to her absolute delight, Let's have an old-fashioned Christmas, like the old days. Get all the kids together under one roof. A Christmas for the ages.
Becky was ecstatic. All the children together for Christmas and the grandchildren. She asked for money to buy presents and a Christmas tree, and Gene gave her all she wanted, and more. Maybe he was changing. He'd always been so stingy earlier.
Gene had one condition. Since so many people were going to be coming to the homestead, they needed a fresh new outhouse, and the kids had to dig him a big new hole.
Chapter 10, Christmas, 1987.
Well, I'm all for Christmas, all the happy smiles and the wishes, and I want it all from the lights to the mistletoe. Tell me one thing, is there anything that you're missing? I will keep you warm as soon as you remove that snow. Whatever we do, we will be alright. These holiday wonders will open your mind. May all your wishes tonight come true. The love I lived, the dream I knew. This Christmas I only wanna be close to you.
On December 22nd, 1987, little Gene and his 3-year-old daughter Barbara had driven to Arkansas from New Mexico for the Christmas holidays and had settled in at the strange homestead his father called Mockingbird Hill.
It was morning, and Loretta, Eddie, Marianne had just caught the bus to school, so the house was now quiet. Little Gene was lying down, and Becky was playing with her granddaughter in a back room.
The Christmas tree was blinking lights. The television was on in the corner, casting a blue glow, as Big Gene slipped out of his bedroom, pockets stuffed with bullets, a .22 revolver in his belt, and a heavy steel pipe in his hand. Gene walked up to his son where he lay with his eyes shut and cracked him in the head with the pipe.
Little Gene screamed, blood gushing from his head. Leaping up, he charged at his father, who whipped out his pistol and shot his son in the chest.
Still, little Gene kept coming, so Gene shot him again in the face. And this time he fell, and as he hit the ground, Gene fired a bullet into the back of his head, shattering his cranium and showering blood and soft tissue across the room. Little Gene's body going into spasmodic convulsion.
Gene then entered the room where his wife sat on the bed, cradling their weeping 3-year-old grandchild Barbara, who was dressed in yellow footsie pajamas. Becky looked up at her husband and said,
Gene, don't kill me.
As Becky tried to shield her grandchild, Gene began to beat her about the head with the pipe and then shot her twice in the head. He rolled the body of his wife over, exposing their weeping grandchild, took a nylon fish stringer, a rope meant to hang multiple catches when fishing, looped it twice around his granddaughter's throat, and strangled her to death.
He drank a beer, then dragged his wife's corpse out into the crabgrass and scrub oak, loaded her into a wheelbarrow, and pushed her up the hill into the latrine pit he'd had his children dig, dumping her into the damp and cold darkness, returning to the house for the bodies of his namesake son and granddaughter, tossing them all into what he called his waste disposal site.
He then tidied up the house for the children who'd soon be returning home from school, mopping up the blood from the linoleum floor, stripping the sheets off the bed he'd shot his wife and strangled his granddaughter on, throwing these into the outhouse hole as well.
He drank another beer, watched some television, then went down to the bus stop to wait for Loretta, Eddie, Marianne, and Becky.
I've got a mistletoe in my hand, and the boys are lining up for my kisses all for one special guy. He's a dreamboat of a man, my own sweet buttercup. I'm just so revved up by his presence. So let this mistletoe moment be that brand new start. Let this mistletoe.
When the bus pulled up and his children came bounding off, Loretta wearing a Jesus Loves You t-shirt, Gene gave them a warm smile, his eyes twinkling, and told them he and Becky had a Christmas surprise for each of them, but they all had to receive their presents separately.
He walked them up the rutted clay drive past junked cars and no trespassing signs, then had Eddie, Marianne, and Becky wait in their old Chevrolet station wagon, listening to Christmas carols on the radio, while he led Loretta up to the ramshackle house with a cinder block chimney.
It was dark in the house, only the lights of the Christmas tree and the television glow. A faint coppery smell of blood and gunpowder still lingering.
"What is it?" Loretta asked. "What do you want to give me? Where's Mom?"
"Come into my room. I've got a present for you," Gene commanded her, beckoning her into a place she'd always been forbidden to enter.
No, you can give it to me later. Where's Mom?"
"You've told me that for the last time," Gene said, grabbing his daughter by the hair and punching her in the face twice, then throwing her into his room. He then whipped out the braided nylon fish stringer from his pocket, wrapped it around her neck, where it became entangled with the crucifix she was wearing, and began to choke her.
Loretta kicked and fought, losing her wristwatch and an earring in the struggle. But eventually, the lack of oxygen to her brain caused her to lose consciousness.
Gene dragged her to the bathroom, where they kept a barrel of water for washing, and dunked her into the barrel beneath the water until he was certain she was dead. He then carried her lifeless body to her bedroom and laid her across her bed, posters of Jesus and rock stars gazing down upon them.
Gene then went back to the car and got Eddie, bringing him inside where he strangled him with the nylon fish stringer. Then Marianne, then Becky.
After drinking a bottle of wine, he got out the wheelbarrow and began to haul the children's bodies up the hill into that pit in the earth he'd had them dig for Christmas.
He doused the bodies with kerosene, apparently in an attempt to mask the smell, then wound barbed wire over the top of the pit, then covered this with a tarp, as he didn't want animals getting in there and dragging the bodies all over the land.
For 4 days, Ronald Gene Simmons sat in that bizarre house of horror, welded together, tearing at the seams, drinking and watching television alone. Most of his family starting to rot in a pit on the hill. All day Christmas of 1987, he sat in that silent, forlorn and haunted tumble-down shack with the Christmas tree lights blinking in the phosphorescent glow of the television.
Then, on the 26th, the rest of the family began to arrive to celebrate.
First Billy and his wife Renata and their 20-month-old son, Trey, who were ambushed and quickly shot to death. Billy and Renata and Trey were then laid out by the Christmas tree.
Then his daughter, Sheila, with her husband Dennis, their child Michael, just a year old, and 7-year-old Sylvia Gale, who was both Gene's daughter and grandchild. While Dennis grabbed things from the car, Sheila and her children entered the dark house, calling out for Grandma Becky. And there stood Gene in the glow of blinking Christmas tree lights.
I'm glad you could come, little princess. Is there something wrong? I told you over and over what you were doing to this family.
What is wrong with you? Where's Mom?
It is time, precious. I love you more than anything in life, but you and Dennis have destroyed us. You turn your back on this family, and now you'll have to pay. I still love you, princess. I'll always love you. And I'll meet you again in hell.
The first shot hit her in the lip, the next blow her right eye, and the third her cheek.
Dennis, hearing the shots, came racing in, his wife lying dead on the floor with their child clutched in her arms. And Gene shot him behind the ear, a bullet entering his skull, whipping through his brain, killing him instantly.
Gene then took the nylon fish stringer, wrapped it around the neck of his weeping daughter, and strangled her to death. When he was done, he did the same thing with his year-old grandson, Michael.
He laid them all out there beside the tree, taking their very best tablecloth, a treasured heirloom, and wrapping his sweet pea princess Sheila with it. He took the infants, Michael and Trey, and wrapped them in plastic, and shoved them into the trunks of junked cars parked along Little Princess Lane.
Jingle bells ringing in my ear. Jingle bell, a sound that's oh so dear. Frosty the snowman is all around town. Watch out for reindeers are falling down. We stay up waiting for Santa tonight. He climbs down the chimney at the speed of light while we're dancing around the Christmas.
He then sat and thought about who else he'd like to kill. Who else in this town had wronged him, belittled him, betrayed him. He took a pen and made a list with directions.
Number 1, Kathy. You're partly the cause. Peel and Eddie, S. Glenwood. Leave west on Main Street. 2, Taylor at the oil company. Leave east on Main Street. 3, Salyer at the mini mart. Leave east. 4, Joyce, know-nothing bitch at Woodline, Airport Road.
In the morning, he put his snub-nosed revolver in the pocket of his coat and placed a 6-shot Ruger in a paper bag with a box of saltines, a letter to his mother-in-law, and a bottle of wine.
He locked the house from the inside and wiggled out through a window, the same window the sheriff would be using to enter the house a few hours later.
Chapter 11. The Trial.
After being arrested, Gene would eventually give a full and detailed confession.
He stated he wanted the death penalty, and in a bizarre catch-22, the only way to get it was to plead innocent. If he pled guilty, the maximum punishment would be an automatic life sentence.
The first trial was for the murders of Kathy Kendrick and Jim Chapin during his day of spree killings on December 28th. At his request, his lawyers called no witnesses and presented no evidence.
After a 4-day trial, it took the jury just an hour and a half to find him guilty. And on May 12, 1988, he was sentenced to death plus 30 years for each of 4 attempted capital murder counts, 20 years for a 5th attempted capital court, and 7 years for a first-degree false imprisonment charge.
He thanked the jury for their death penalty and waived his right to appeal, something that's usually automatic, but I guess was not in Arkansas at that time.
Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton set Simmons' execution date for August 9th. But U.S. District Judge G. Thomas Ezel stayed the execution on August 3rd, 1988, telling lawyers he would decide later in the month whether a court review in death penalty cases is mandatory and whether Simmons was competent to waive his right to appeal.
In January 1988, the house on Mockingbird Hill, which had been foreclosed on and was often vandalized, burned to the ground.
On Monday, February 6th, 1989, the trial for the killing of his family began.
During this trial, prosecutor John Bynum worked hard at painting Ronald Gene Simmons as the utter scumbag that he was, and introduced a lot of letters between he and Sheila into evidence, reading them aloud, these disgusting pleas of love and threats to see her in hell. This evidently really pissed old Gene off, as during a sidebar, Gene managed to punch the prosecutor right in the face, knocking him over.
Jesus. When a deputy ran over, Gene snatched at his gun and nearly got it out before being tackled and dragged out of the courtroom, screaming obscenities.
For the rest of the trial, Gene Simmons would be in shackles.
Later, he'd be asked why he did it, and would smile and say he wanted the jury's last impression of him to be out-of-control violence in order to secure the death penalty.
If so, it worked. The jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death by lethal injection. Governor Bill Clinton again setting the date, this time April 5th.
But on March 29, 1989, the Eighth Circuit again delayed Simmons' execution, as a Catholic priest and another man on death row were saying it was unconstitutional to have a death sentence without appeal, and would set a precedent. This time it went all the way to the Supreme Court, who voted that one could deny their right to appeal the death sentence.
So for the third time, Governor Bill Clinton signed a death warrant for Simmons, this one for June 25th, 1990, nearly 2 years after the original death sentence date.
And this time the order would stick. Ronald Gene Simmons was strapped down to a gurney, his last words being, quote, "Justice delayed, finally be done, is justifiable homicide," end quote. Then he was injected with midazolam, a sedative, then vicuronium bromide, which paralyzed his body, and finally potassium chloride, which stopped his heart from beating.
This execution was significant for Arkansas, as that was the first lethal injection there. Also the first where an inmate waived his right to an appeal, and was the second execution since the resumption of capital punishment after a 26-year moratorium. And
that, ladies and gentlemen, is the truly horrific and tragic story of family annihilator and spree killer Ronald Gene Simmons and the Mockingbird Hill Massacre. Thank you so much for listening.
And do you have a case you'd like us to cover? Did we get something wrong? You want to say hi? You got some music you'd like us to play? Whatever. Reach out to us anytime at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will check you later.